Sirens rarely announce the sudden, catastrophic end of a corrupt career. Sometimes the downfall begins with the simple clink of a coffee spoon. Inside a greasy small-town diner, a local sheriff, drunk on unchecked authority, decides to publicly humiliate a quiet black man enjoying his pancakes. The sheriff violently snaps his handcuffs shut, grinning at his supposedly helpless target. I had absolutely no idea. The man whose wrists he just bruised was the sitting director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Oak Haven, Georgia, was the kind of town that time seemed to have deliberately ignored. Nestled deep within the state's humid interior, it was a place where the county line felt more like a heavily guarded border than a simple geographic marker. The town boasted a population of barely 4,000, a single flashing traffic light that hadn't shown green in decades, and a deeply entrenched social hierarchy governed entirely by one man, Sheriff Harlan Briggs. The brass bell above the door of Pat's Skillet rang out. The diner was a local institution, a long, narrow room smelling of bacon grease, bleach, and decades of unfiltered cigarette smoke that had long since stained the acoustic ceiling tiles a sickly yellow. Sitting in a corner booth, facing the door out of long-established habit, was Elias Voss. Elias was 54, distinguished, with salt and pepper hair cut close to his scalp and a posture that radiated quiet discipline. He wore a simple, unbranded navy blue sweater over a collared shirt and sharply pressed khaki trousers. To the untrained eye, he looked like a weary insurance adjuster, or perhaps a high school principal passing through on his way to Atlanta. Elias was savoring a plate of over-easy eggs, dry toast, and a mug of aggressively bitter black coffee. I was in Oak Haven by pure chance. His heavily armored black Chevrolet Suburban had suffered a minor tire pressure sensor failure a few miles back on the interstate. His driver and his two-man protective detail were currently at a nearby service station dealing with the vehicle. Craving a moment of solitude away from the suffocating bubble of Washington, D.C. security protocols, Elias had instructed his detail to give him a stretch of peace in the diner. He just wanted to read the morning paper and eat a normal meal, like a normal citizen. He was halfway through a front-page article on federal cybersecurity initiatives when Sheriff Harlan Briggs walked into Pat's Skillet. Briggs was a massive man standing 6'3" with a barrel chest that strained the buttons of his tightly tailored tan uniform. His boots struck the faded checkerboard linoleum with the heavy, deliberate thud of a man who owned the floor beneath him. A heavy leather duty belt creaked around his waist, adorned with a Glock 19, 2 sets of polished steel handcuffs, a taser, and a heavy maglite. Accompanying Briggs was Deputy Cole Brennan, a young, slightly nervous-looking man in his late 20s who hovered a half step behind the sheriff like a reluctant shadow. The ambient chatter in the diner instantly dropped by several decibels. Old men in trucker hats looked down at their grits. The waitress, an older woman named Clara, who had been pouring coffee when the sheriff entered, stiffened visibly. It was a well-known fact in Oak Haven that a visit from Sheriff Briggs was rarely a social call. Briggs ruled the county like a medieval thief. He doled out favors, crushed dissent, and took a profound sadistic pleasure in reminding everyone who held the monopoly on violence in his town. Briggs paused near the cash register, his pale blue eyes sweeping the room. They slid past the regulars, past Clara, and slammed to a halt on the solitary figure sitting in the corner booth. Elias Voss didn't look up from his newspaper, but his peripheral vision had already registered the sheriff's entrance. Years of fieldwork, undercover assignments, and surviving the treacherous political battlefields of the nation's capital had honed Elias's situational awareness to a razor's edge. He noted the heavy footfalls stopping, the sudden shift in the room's energy, and the unmistakable weight of a predatory gaze fixing upon him. "Morning, Clara," Briggs rumbled, his voice a deep, gravelly drawl that carried across the quiet diner. He didn't take his eyes off Elias. "We got a stray in the house today." Clara nervously wiped her hands on her apron. "Just a gentleman passing through, Sheriff. Wanted some breakfast." "Is that right?" Briggs smirked, adjusting his duty belt in a blatant display of intimidation. To Harlan Briggs, a stranger in his town was suspicious. A black man dressed sharply, exuding an air of quiet confidence, and unbothered by the sheriff's towering presence was an outright provocation. Elias calmly turned the page of his newspaper. He took a slow sip of his coffee. He knew exactly what was happening. He had seen men like Harlan Briggs 1,000 times before in his early days as a beat cop and later as a young field agent in the Deep South. Small men who needed a shiny badge and a gun to make themselves feel big. Briggs slowly closed the distance between the register and the corner booth. Deputy Brennan followed, his hand resting instinctively near his radio. The heavy thud of the sheriff's boots stopped inches from Elias's table. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in Pat's skillet was the sizzle of hash browns on the flat-top grill behind the counter. "You lost, buddy?" Briggs asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Elias slowly lowered his newspaper. He looked up at the sheriff, his expression completely neutral, his dark eyes unblinking and entirely devoid of the fear Briggs was so accustomed to seeing. "Good morning, Sheriff," Elias said, his voice smooth, calm, and perfectly modulated. "I'm not lost, just enjoying my breakfast." Briggs's jaw tightened. The lack of deference was an immediate insult to his fragile ego. "I didn't ask if you were enjoying your breakfast. I asked what you're doing in my town. We don't get a lot of your kind driving through Oakhaven unless they took a wrong turn." "My vehicle is being serviced a few blocks from here," Elias replied evenly, ignoring the racial dog whistle entirely. "Once it's finished, I'll be on my way. Is there a law against patronizing a local business?" Briggs leaned forward, placing two massive, calloused hands on the edge of Elias's table. He leaned in close, attempting to use his physical size to dominate the space. "In my county, the law is whatever I say it is, and I say you look suspicious. I want to see some ID." Elias did not reach for his wallet. Instead, he maintained eye contact, his demeanor as immovable as a mountain. He knew the law backward and forward. He had written policy on it. I had testified before Congress about it. "Sheriff," Elias said, keeping his voice low and respectful, yet carrying an undeniable edge of authority. "Unless you have reasonable, articulable suspicion that I have committed, am committing, or am about to commit a crime, I am under no legal obligation to provide you with my identification. I am simply sitting here eating." A collective silent gasp seemed to suck the oxygen out of the diner. Deputy Brennan's eyes widened. Clara froze with a coffee pot suspended in midair. No one, absolutely no one, spoke to Sheriff Harlan Briggs like that. Not the mayor, not the local judge, and certainly not a stranger. Briggs' face flushed a deep mottled red. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his collar. The challenge to his authority, delivered so calmly, so clinically, was a match thrown into a powder keg. "Boy!" Briggs hissed, the mask of the friendly neighborhood lawman completely dropping away to reveal the tyrant underneath. "You must have lost your damn mind. You're in Oakhaven County. You are breathing my air. Now you're going to hand over your driver's license, or I'm going to drag you out of that booth and show you exactly how we deal with smart aleck outsiders who think they know the law." Elias sighed softly. It was a sound of profound disappointment. "I wasn't afraid." He was simply exhausted by the tragic predictability of it all. He slowly folded his newspaper and placed it neatly on the table. "Sheriff," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a terrifying stillness, "I strongly advise you to take a step back, reconsider your current course of action, and walk away. If you escalate this, it will be the greatest mistake of your professional life." The silence in Pat's skillet became physically oppressive. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Sheriff Harlan Briggs stared at Elias Voss, his mind briefly short-circuiting. The warning delivered by this stranger was so absolute, so devoid of bluff or bravado, that for a fraction of a second, an instinctual alarm bell rang in the back of the sheriff's mind. But arrogance is a blinding disease. Briggs had spent 2 decades bullying the residents of Oakhaven without consequence. He had beaten men in holding cells, extorted local businesses, and ruined lives with the stroke of a pen. He was the apex predator of this county. He was not about to be intimidated by a man eating eggs. "Mistake?" Briggs barked, letting out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed off the linoleum walls. He looked back at his deputy. "Did you hear that, Brennan? The tourist is giving me advice." Deputy Brennan swallowed hard, looking visibly uncomfortable. "Sheriff, maybe we should just let him finish his breakfast. We got that call about the break-in over at the salvage yard." "Shut up, Brennan," Briggs snapped, turning his venom back to Elias. "Stand up right now. You're under arrest." Elias didn't move. He kept his hands resting flat on the table, entirely visible. Under arrest for what exactly? What is the charge? Sheriff interfering with the police investigation. Failure to identify. Resisting. Briggs rattled off, his hand dropping to the heavy steel handcuffs on his belt. I'll figure out the rest when I get you in a cell. Now get up before I tase you right out of that booth. Clara, the waitress, couldn't take it anymore. She took a hesitant step forward. Harlan, please, he ain't done nothing. He just paid for his food. I said stay out of it, Clara. Briggs roared, pointing a thick, accusing finger at her. She flinched and retreated behind the counter. Elias Voss shook his head slowly. You are violating my Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure, Sheriff. You are initiating an unlawful arrest under color of law, which is a federal crime under Title 18, Section 242 of the United States Code. I am giving you one final opportunity to walk out that door. Briggs's eyes went completely dead. He unclipped his handcuffs. Get on your feet, Briggs commanded, drawing his taser with his left hand and pointing the red laser dot directly at Elias's chest. Now. Elias Voss weighed his options in the span of a microsecond. He could announce his identity right now. He could tell the sheriff that he was Elias Voss, the director of the FBI, appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and currently overseeing 35,000 federal agents. He could pull his credentials and end this charade. But as Elias looked into the hateful, tyrannical eyes of Harlan Briggs, a cold, hard resolve settled over him. If Briggs was willing to do this to him, a man sitting quietly in a diner, what had he done to the people of this county who didn't have the power to fight back? How many lives had this badge-wearing thug destroyed? How many false arrests? How many civil rights violations? Elias decided right then and there that he was going to let Harlan Briggs dig his own grave, and he was going to let him dig it as deep as possible. I was going to expose the rot in this county, not by pulling rank, but by becoming the victim Briggs so desperately wanted him to be. Slowly, deliberately, Elias slid out of the booth. He kept his hands raised at shoulder height, palms open and empty. He stood to his full height, which, while not as massive as Briggs, carried a coiled athletic tension. Turn around, Briggs barked. Hands behind your back. Elias complied without a word. He turned his back to the sheriff and brought his hands behind him. Briggs grabbed Elias's wrists with excessive, brutal force, twisting his left arm up painfully toward his shoulder blades. Elias didn't wince. He didn't make a sound. The heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted shut around his wrists, the teeth biting deeply into his skin. Briggs intentionally squeezed the cuffs one notch tighter than necessary, a petty, vindictive move designed to inflict pain. Not so tough now, are you, citing the Constitution? Briggs sneered, grabbing the chain connecting the cuffs and jerking Elias backward. You haven't patted me down, Sheriff, Elias said quietly, staring straight ahead at the diner wall. You haven't read me my Miranda rights. You haven't secured the scene. Your procedural execution is abysmal. I'll read you your rights when I feel like it. Briggs shoved Elias forward toward the door. Brennan, get the door! Deputy Brennan hurried forward, his face pale, and pushed the heavy glass door open. As Briggs marched him out, Elias caught the eyes of the diner patrons. They were looking down, terrified, complicit in their silence. It fueled the quiet fire burning in his chest. Outside, the Georgia heat was already oppressive. The sheriff's cruiser, a large, aggressive-looking SUV with heavily tinted windows, was parked diagonally across two spots directly in front of the diner. Briggs shoved Elias against the rear door of the SUV, pinning him against the hot metal. The sheriff began a rough, invasive pat-down. He patted down Elias's legs, his waist. He reached into Elias's back pocket and pulled out his leather wallet. Here it is, Elias thought, the moment of truth. Inside that wallet was a solid gold badge that commanded the respect of every law enforcement agency on the planet. Beside it was a reinforced federal identification card bearing the seal of the Department of Justice. But Harlan Briggs was a man blinded by his own ego. He didn't even open the wallet. He didn't look for an ID. To look at the ID would be to acknowledge Elias as a person. Instead, Briggs simply tossed the heavy wallet onto the hood of the cruiser. He then reached into Elias's front pocket and pulled out his encrypted government smartphone. He tossed that onto the hood as well. Open the back, Brennan, Briggs ordered. The deputy opened the rear door, revealing the hard plastic seats and the heavy metal cage separating the back from the front. Briggs grabbed Elias by the back of his sweater and roughly forced him downward, nearly slamming his head against the doorframe before shoving him into the stifling heat of the back seat. Elias adjusted himself on the hard plastic, ignoring the sharp pain radiating from his over-tightened wrists. The door slammed shut with a heavy final thud. Through the cage, Elias watched as Briggs grabbed his wallet and phone from the hood, carelessly tossing them into a canvas evidence bag he kept in the passenger seat. Briggs slid into the passenger side while Deputy Brennan climbed into the driver's seat. "Take us to the station, Cole," Briggs ordered, turning around to look through the metal mesh at his prisoner. He had a triumphant, ugly smirk on his face. "Let's get our constitutional scholar processed." The engine of the police SUV roared to life, and the air conditioning blasted on, though little of the cool air reached the caged back seat. Deputy Brennan shifted the vehicle into drive and pulled away from Pat's Skillet, the tires crunching over the loose gravel of the parking lot. Elias Voss sat in the back, his posture perfectly erect despite the uncomfortable angle of his cuffed arms. He looked out the window as they rolled through the streets of Oak Haven. It was a dying town. Boarded up storefronts with faded signs, overgrown lots filled with rusting machinery, and small sagging houses with peeling paint. It was a town that had been economically choked, and the corruption of its local law enforcement clearly wasn't helping the revitalization efforts. "So," Briggs said loudly, twisting his massive frame in the passenger seat to glare through the metal grate, "you like running your mouth about federal law, huh? You a lawyer or something? One of those ACLU types down from Atlanta looking to cause trouble." Elias met the sheriff's gaze through the grate. His eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely unbothered. "I am familiar with the law, Sheriff," Elias said smoothly. "Intimately familiar. For instance, I know that under the color of law statutes, willfully depriving a person of a right or privilege protected by the Constitution is a felony. I also know that standard procedure mandates a supervisor be notified when an arrest is made without a warrant or prior dispatch authorization. Did you radio this in?" Deputy Brennan's hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He glanced nervously at the sheriff. Elias was right. They hadn't radioed dispatch. Briggs laughed a harsh, grating sound. "You think you're pretty smart, don't you? Let me explain how things work in the real world, buddy. Out here, I am the supervisor, I am the dispatch, I am the judge before the judge even wakes up. You come into my town, you disrespect me in front of my people, you go to jail. It's that simple." "It is rarely that simple," Elias replied softly. "Power unchecked inevitably leads to ruin. You've operated in a vacuum for a long time, Sheriff. You've mistaken local fear for genuine authority." Briggs's smile vanished. The psychological armor Elias wore, his absolute refusal to show fear, anger, or submission, was deeply unsettling to the sheriff. People were supposed to beg. They were supposed to apologize. They were supposed to break. This man was talking to him as if he were giving a performance review. "Brennan, hit the lights," Briggs snapped. "I want to get this guy in a cell. I'm tired of listening to him." "Sheriff, there's no traffic." "I said hit the damn lights." The interior of the cabin flashed with the reflection of red and blue strobes as Brennan obediently flipped the switches. The siren wailed an unnecessary theatrical display of dominance as they sped down the empty main street of Oak Haven. They pulled up to a squat, brutalist concrete building on the edge of town. The faded letters on the side read Oak Haven County Sheriff's Department. The building looked more like a bunker than a public service office. There were no windows on the ground floor, just heavily reinforced steel doors. Brennan parked the cruiser in the sally port. The heavy garage doors rolled down behind them with a loud mechanical screech, sealing them inside the concrete echo chamber. Briggs stepped out, hauling the canvas bag containing Elias's wallet and phone. He walked around to the back door and yanked it open. "Out," Briggs commanded. Elias slid awkwardly out of the vehicle, finding his footing on the oil-stained concrete. His shoulders ached from being pinned backward, but his face betrayed nothing. Briggs grabbed him by the bicep, his grip unnecessarily tight, and marched him toward the heavy steel door leading into the booking area. Brennan trailed behind, carrying his clipboard, looking increasingly like a man walking to his own execution. They entered the booking room. It was a bleak, fluorescent-lit space that smelled of sweat, cheap pine cleaner, and despair. A middle-aged woman in a dispatch uniform sat behind a raised bulletproof glass partition. She looked up from a crossword puzzle as they entered. "Morning, Harlan," she said casually, popping a bubble of chewing gum. "Who's this?" "Jane Doe's brother," Briggs sneered, pushing Elias toward a metal bench bolted to the floor. "Sit down." Elias sat. Briggs walked over to the booking counter and dumped the canvas bag. He pulled out Elias's phone and wallet. "All right, let's see who our constitutional scholar really is," Briggs muttered. For a brief second, Elias thought the game was over. Briggs was going to open the wallet. He was going to see the gold shield, the FBI director's badge. He was going to see the name Elias Voss. But at that exact moment, the heavy door to the booking room banged open. A frantic-looking deputy rushed in. "Sheriff, we got a major 1050 out on Highway 9. 2 semi-trucks. One's hauling chemicals. It's a mess. Traffic is backed up to the county line. We need everybody out there." Briggs cursed loudly, slamming Elias's wallet back down onto the counter without opening it. The universe, it seemed, was conspiring to keep the sheriff in the dark just a little bit longer. "Damn it," Briggs growled. He looked at the dispatcher. "Doris, put his stuff in lockbox 4. Don't even process him yet. Let him sit on that bench and sweat for a few hours. I'll deal with him when I get back." Doris nodded lazily. "You got it, Harlan." Briggs pointed a thick finger at Elias. "Don't you move. You sit right there. You're going to learn about respect today." Briggs turned and stormed out of the booking room, the frantic deputy trailing right behind him. The heavy door slammed shut. The room fell quiet, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the static chatter from Doris's radio console. Deputy Brennan was still standing in the room. He hadn't been ordered to Highway 9. He stood near the counter looking at Elias, then looking at the wallet sitting on the desk. "Deputy," Elias said, his voice breaking the silence. It was calm, authoritative, and carried a weight that made Brennan physically flinch. Brennan looked at the prisoner. "Yeah, I have been detained for over 30 minutes, Elias stated clearly, looking up at the young deputy. "I have not been processed. I have not been charged. By law, you are required to allow me my phone call." Brennan hesitated. He knew the law. He knew Briggs was breaking about 6 different departmental policies right now, but Briggs was the sheriff. "Sheriff said to let you sit," Brennan mumbled, looking away. "Deputy Brennan," Elias said, reading the young man's name tag. "Right now, you are an accessory to false imprisonment, deprivation of rights under color of law, and kidnapping. Your sheriff just left the building. That makes you the ranking officer in this room. You are standing at a precipice, son. You can either follow a corrupt tyrant off a cliff, or you can uphold the oath you swore to the Constitution and let me make my phone call. Which side of the line do you want to be on when the hammer falls?" Brennan stared at the man in handcuffs. There was no panic in Elias's voice. There was no anger. There was only absolute, terrifying certainty. It was the voice of a man who held power far beyond the concrete walls of this small-town jail. Brennan swallowed hard. His hands were shaking. He looked at Doris behind the glass. She wasn't paying attention. She was back to her crossword. Brennan walked over to the counter. He picked up the heavy black desk phone and brought it over to the metal bench. He placed it on the bench next to Elias. "One call," Brennan whispered, his voice trembling. "Make it quick." Elias didn't smile, but a look of profound respect crossed his eyes. "You just saved your career, deputy." Because his hands were cuffed behind his back, Elias could not dial the phone. He looked at Brennan. "I need you to dial the number for me, deputy," Elias said calmly. "Who am I calling?" Brennan asked, picking up the receiver and readying his finger over the keypad. Elias took a slow, deep breath. "Dial 202-3430, Elias said, reciting the number from memory. Brennan punched the numbers in. "Okay, it's ringing." "Who is this?" "Put it on speaker," Elias instructed. Brennan pressed the speaker button and held the phone near Elias. The phone rang twice. Then a crisp, professional voice echoed out of the speaker into the bleak booking room. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, National Threat Operations Center. This is a secure line. State your authorization code." Deputy Brennan's blood ran cold. The phone nearly slipped from his sweaty fingers. His eyes widened to the size of saucers as he stared down at the man in handcuffs. Elias leaned slightly toward the phone. "Authorization code Alpha Tango 970. This is Director Elias Voss. Priority override. Connect me immediately to Special Agent in Charge Grant Whitfield at the Atlanta Field Office. Tell him he has a hostage situation in Oak Haven County, and the hostage is me. 200 miles away inside the heavily fortified FBI Atlanta Field Office, Special Agent in Charge Grant Whitfield was halfway through his second cup of morning coffee when his secure line flashed red. A red flash on that specific phone meant a priority override from Washington, a rarity that usually signaled a catastrophic national security event. Whitfield, a 20-year veteran with a sharp jawline and a no-nonsense demeanor, snatched the receiver off the cradle. "Whitfield, Grant." The voice on the other end was preternaturally calm, yet the audio quality carried the slight tinny echo of a speakerphone. "It's Elias." Whitfield sat bolt upright, his coffee sloshing over the rim of his mug onto his desk. He recognized the voice instantly. "Director Voss, sir, are you on a secure line? Where are you?" "I am currently sitting in the booking room of the Oak Haven County Sheriff's Department," Elias replied, his voice steady. "I am handcuffed to a metal bench. I was unlawfully detained at a local diner by a Sheriff Harlan Briggs. My detail is separated from me. Do you have my location?" Whitfield's mind struggled to process the sheer absurdity of the statement. The director of the FBI, the most powerful law enforcement officer in the world, was handcuffed in a Podunk County jail in rural Georgia. It was unthinkable. "Sir, are you injured?" Whitfield asked, his hand already hovering over the general quarters alarm on his desk. "I am uninjured," Elias said. "But Sheriff Briggs is highly volatile and operating entirely outside the bounds of the law. I need you to mobilize a tactical element and deploy to my location. Do not, I repeat, do not contact local dispatch or county authorities. This department is compromised. You are to lock down this facility." "Understood, Director. We are wheels up immediately. ETA is under an hour. Sit tight." "I'm not going anywhere. Elias out." Whitfield slammed the phone down and hit the alarm. The quiet, bureaucratic hum of the field office shattered instantly as sirens blared. Agents sprang from their desks. Whitfield threw open his office door and bellowed into the bullpen. "Listen up. I want SWAT geared and on the roof for helo attack in 3 minutes. I want every available field agent in a vehicle rolling south on I-75 right now. The director of the FBI has been taken hostage by a rogue local sheriff in Oak Haven County. Move, move, move." Simultaneously, back in the town of Oak Haven, panic of a different sort was setting in. At a dusty service station 3 blocks from Pat's Skillet, Special Agent Trent Harlow was pacing furiously. Harlow was the head of the director's protective detail, a man whose entire existence revolved around keeping Elias Voss safe. The tire on the armored Suburban had been swapped, but Harlow had just checked his watch. It had been far too long. Harlow pulled out his earpiece radio. "Command, this is Detail Lead. I'm trying to reach the package on his primary device. It's going straight to voicemail. Put a trace on his GPS signal." A few seconds later, the Tactical Operations Center in D.C. replied, "Lead, the package's devices are stationary at the Oak Haven County Sheriff's Department. Be advised, SAC Atlanta just issued a code red mobilization to that exact location." Harlow's blood turned to ice. He didn't wait for further explanation. He threw himself into the driver's seat of the Suburban. "Get in, they're moving," he yelled to the 2 other detail agents. The massive black SUV roared out of the service station, tires smoking as Harlow drifted it onto the main street. He didn't go straight to the station. He pulled up aggressively in front of Pat's Skillet, mounting the curb. Harlow burst through the diner doors, his hand resting conspicuously on the butt of his sidearm. "Where is the man who was sitting in that corner booth?" Harlow demanded, his voice echoing like a gunshot in the quiet diner. Clara, the waitress, trembling, pointed a shaky finger in the direction of the police station. Sheriff Briggs took him, cuffed, and stuffed him right out the door. Said he was asking too many questions. Harlow didn't say another word. He spun on his heels, sprinting back to the Suburban. The fury radiating from him was palpable. Harlan Briggs had no idea what kind of storm he had just summoned. He hadn't just crossed a line. He had declared war on the federal government, and the federal government was about to arrive at his doorstep with a hammer. Inside the bleak booking room of the Oak Haven County Jail, Deputy Cole Brennan was hyperventilating. He had just hung up the phone. He stared at Elias Voss, the color completely drained from his face. You're the director of the FBI," Brennan stammered, his voice cracking. "Oh, dear God, oh my God." "Breathe, deputy," Elias instructed calmly, shifting his weight on the uncomfortable metal bench. "You facilitated my phone call. You followed federal law when your superior officer abandoned it. You are going to be fine, but right now, you need to maintain your composure." Doris, the dispatcher on the other side of the bulletproof glass, finally looked up from her crossword puzzle. She frowned at Brennan's panicked state. "Cole, what's wrong with you? You look like you just saw a ghost." "Nothing, Doris," Brennan choked out, practically diving away from the phone. "Just a stomach bug. Ate some bad eggs." Elias offered a microscopic nod of approval. "Now," Elias said softly to Brennan, "put the phone exactly where it was. When Sheriff Briggs returns, you will not mention this call. You will let him proceed exactly as he intended." But, sir," Brennan whispered frantically, wiping sweat from his forehead. "He's going to hurt you. If he thinks you're just some guy, he gets physical. I can't let him assault a federal director." "You will not interfere, deputy?" Elias commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Sheriff Briggs needs to fully commit to his actions on camera and in front of witnesses. The Department of Justice is going to dismantle this corrupt thief piece by piece, and Briggs is currently providing all the evidence we need. Stand down." Brennan swallowed hard and nodded, retreating to the corner of the room, looking like a man awaiting a firing squad. Later, the heavy steel door from the Sallyport groaned open. Sheriff Harlan Briggs swaggered in, dusting off his uniform. The highway accident had been a minor inconvenience, but he was back in his domain, now ready to assert his dominance over the stranger who had dared to talk back to him. "Well, well, well." Briggs boomed, his heavy boots echoing on the concrete. He walked over to the booking counter and glared down at Elias. "Look who's still here, our resident legal expert. You had enough time to sit and think about your attitude, boy." Elias looked up. "I have thought about very little else, Sheriff." Briggs chuckled a cruel, ugly sound. He walked behind the counter and stood next to Doris. He reached out and grabbed the canvas evidence bag containing Elias's wallet and phone. "Let's see what we're working with here," Briggs muttered. He pulled the leather wallet out and held it in his massive hand. "Sheriff, wait!" Brennan blurted out, unable to stop himself. He took a step forward, his hands raised pleadingly. "Please, just look at the ID. Just open it and look." Briggs shot Brennan a venomous glare. "I told you to shut up, Cole. I'll look at his damn ID when I'm good and ready to process him." He slammed the wallet down on the counter, unopened. Briggs walked around the counter and approached Elias, invading his personal space. He leaned down, his face inches from Elias's, smelling heavily of stale coffee and chewing tobacco. "You see, out here, we don't care about your fancy constitutional rights," Briggs growled, poking Elias hard in the chest with a thick index finger. "Out here, respect is earned through fear, and you don't seem to fear me. So I'm going to take you back to cell block C, where there aren't any cameras, and we are going to have a little conversation about manners. Stand up." Elias didn't move. He stared directly into Briggs's eyes, an ocean of unyielding calm meeting a wall of arrogant rage. "I said stand up," Briggs roared, reaching down and grabbing Elias by the collar of his navy sweater, yanking him forcefully upward. "Sheriff, stop!" Brennan screamed, finally drawing his taser and pointing it at his own boss. "Let him go right now. You don't know what you're doing." Briggs froze, staring at his deputy in pure, unadulterated shock. Doris dropped her pen, gasping loud enough to be heard through the glass. "Have you lost your damn mind, Brennan?" Briggs bellowed, dropping Elias back onto the bench and turning his fury toward the young deputy. "Put that away before I take it from you and shove it down your throat." But before Briggs could take a step toward Brennan, the building began to vibrate. It started as a low rumble, a deep resonant hum that rattled the fluorescent light fixtures overhead. Then the sound grew deafening. The unmistakable heavy thack-thack-thwack of twin-engine tactical helicopters practically skimming the roof of the concrete jail. Briggs looked up at the ceiling, momentarily distracted. "What the hell is that?" Suddenly, Doris's dispatch console exploded with static. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4 on Main Street. We got massive federal movement, black SUVs, armored trucks. They're blowing through the red lights, heading straight for the station. Before Doris could even process the transmission, a thunderous crash echoed from the Sallyport. The heavy steel garage door that Briggs had just walked through buckled and groaned as an armored Lenko Bearcat rammed directly into it, tearing the metal off its tracks. The ground shook. "What in the absolute hell is going on?" Briggs shouted, drawing his Glock from his holster, his arrogant facade finally cracking into genuine panic. The heavy steel door leading from the Sallyport into the booking room was violently kicked open. "FBI! Nobody move! Drop your weapons! Drop your weapons!" A dozen heavily armored FBI SWAT operators flooded into the tight confines of the booking room like a tidal wave of matte black Kevlar and suppressed assault rifles. Laser sights crisscrossed the room in a dizzying array of red and green beams. Special Agent Trent Harlow pushed his way through the operators, his sidearm drawn, his eyes scanning the room with lethal intent. He saw Elias Voss handcuffed to the bench. Harlow's eyes immediately snapped to Sheriff Harlan Briggs, who was standing there dumbfounded, holding a drawn firearm. "Drop the weapon, Sheriff!" Harlow roared, raising his weapon and putting the front sight squarely on the center of Briggs's chest. "Drop it now, or I will drop you." The booking room of the Oak Haven County Jail was suddenly transformed from a bleak chamber of local tyranny into a terrifying display of federal might. A dozen laser sights, brilliant intersecting beams of red and green, painted Sheriff Harlan Briggs's chest, throat, and forehead. The silence that followed, Special Agent Harlow's booming command was absolute, heavy, and lethal. Sheriff Briggs stood frozen, his brain accustomed only to unquestioned obedience and small-town compliance, completely short-circuited in the face of an overwhelming superior force. He looked at the heavily armored SWAT operators, their faces obscured by ballistic helmets and tactical goggles. He looked at the suppressed muzzles of their M4 carbines. And then slowly he looked down at the Glock 19 trembling in his own right hand. "I said drop it!" Harlow roared again, his voice cracking with adrenaline, his finger tightening incrementally on the trigger of his Sig Sauer. "If you twitch, you die. Drop the weapon." The instinct for self-preservation finally overrode Briggs's stunned paralysis. His thick fingers went limp. The Glock slipped from his grasp, hitting the hard concrete floor with a heavy metallic clatter that echoed off the cinder-block walls. "Hands in the air! Turn around and face the wall!" a SWAT team leader barked, stepping forward with his rifle raised. "Do it now!" Briggs, his face completely drained of its former ruddy arrogance, slowly raised his hands and turned. Before he could fully comply, two operators closed the distance in a blur of black Kevlar. They grabbed his arms with practiced, overwhelming force, slamming him face first against the reinforced glass of the dispatch partition. Doris the dispatcher shrieked and scrambled backward out of her chair, flattening herself against the far wall of her booth in sheer terror. While the tactical team secured the sheriff, Harlow sprinted across the room to the metal bench. He holstered his weapon and dropped to one knee in front of Elias Voss. Harlow's hands were shaking as he reached into his tactical vest, pulling out a master set of handcuff keys. "Sir," Harlow said, his voice dropping to a tight professional whisper, "are you injured? Did he hurt you?" "I am fine, Trent," Elias replied calmly, his heart rate steady despite the chaos erupting around him. He turned his wrists, allowing Harlow to insert the key. The heavy steel cuffs clicked open. Elias brought his arms forward, rubbing the deep, angry red indentations the over-tightened metal had left on his skin. He stood up slowly, rolling his shoulders to work out the stiffness, projecting an aura of immense, unshakable authority. "Status of the perimeter?" Elias asked smoothly, adjusting the collar of his navy sweater. "Secured, Director," Harlow replied, stepping back and flanking him like a Praetorian guard. "SAC Whitfield's helo just touched down on the roof. We have 30 agents locking down the building and establishing a 2-block cordon. Local PD dispatch has been entirely frozen." At the sound of the word "Director," a pathetic, suffocated gasp escaped from the wall where Briggs was currently pinned. The SWAT operator stepped back, leaving Briggs facing the room, though his hands were now firmly zip-tied behind his back. The sheriff looked like a deflated balloon. The swagger, the malice, the towering intimidation, all of it had completely evaporated, replaced by a hollow, sickening terror. He stared at Elias Voss, his pale blue eyes wide and bloodshot. Elias walked slowly across the booking room, his footsteps echoing in the quiet that had settled over the tactical operators. He stopped at the booking counter. He reached out and picked up his leather wallet, the same wallet Briggs had dismissively tossed aside twice. Elias flipped it open. The bright fluorescent lights of the jail caught the polished gold of the badge inside. Above it was the crisp reinforced identification card bearing the seal of the Department of Justice. Elias held the wallet up, ensuring Briggs had a clear, unobstructed view of it. "Sheriff Briggs," Elias said, his voice cold, precise, and echoing with the full weight of the United States government. "My name is Elias Voss. I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I believe you were looking for my identification." Briggs's knees literally buckled. If not for the two SWAT operators flanking him, he would have collapsed onto the concrete floor. His jaw worked silently for a moment, trying to form words, trying to build an apology, but his throat was completely dry. I didn't," Briggs stammered, his voice reduced to a high-pitched, reedy squeak. "I thought you were, I didn't know." "You thought I was a nobody," Elias interrupted, taking a step closer. "You thought I was a solitary black man passing through your town, lacking the resources or the power to defend myself. You believe my lack of a badge made me an acceptable target for your cruelty. That is the most terrifying part of this entire ordeal, Harlan. Not what you did to me, but what you have undoubtedly done to hundreds of citizens who didn't have a SWAT team to call." At that moment, the door to the stairwell swung open, and Special Agent in Charge Grant Whitfield strode into the room, flanked by two more agents in windbreakers. Whitfield took one look at the zip-tied sheriff, the pale-faced deputy cowering in the corner, and the director standing calmly by the counter. "Director Voss," Whitfield said, nodding respectfully. "The building is fully secured. We've locked down the server room and the evidence lockers. My agents are actively preserving all physical and digital files." "Excellent, Grant," Elias said. He turned his attention back to Briggs. "Sheriff Harlan Briggs, you are under arrest for violating Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. You are also being charged with federal kidnapping, false imprisonment, and aggravated assault." Elias paused, looking at the heavy steel handcuffs resting on the booking counter, the very handcuffs Briggs had sadistically squeezed onto his wrists earlier. "Agent Harlow," Elias commanded, gesturing toward the counter. "Cut his zip ties and process him. Use his cuffs. Secure them tightly." "With pleasure, sir," Harlow said, a grim smile touching the corners of his mouth. Briggs began to weep. It was a pathetic, gasping sob that echoed loudly in the room. The apex predator of Oak Haven County was crumbling in real time. "Please, Director, I have a family. I have a pension. Please, we can sort this out. I made a mistake." "You made a choice," Elias corrected coldly. "Over and over again for years, you made a choice, and today, the bill has come due." Harlow cut the plastic ties, grabbed Briggs's wrists, and violently yanked them backward, snapping the sheriff's own steel handcuffs onto his wrists. The metallic clicks echoed like the slamming of a vault door on Briggs's life. Soon, the Oak Haven County Sheriff's Department was unrecognizable. The sleepy, corrupt bunker had been transformed into a bustling federal command center. Agents in FBI windbreakers moved with surgical precision, carrying boxes of heavily redacted files out of Briggs's private office. Forensics technicians were pulling hard drives from the dispatch servers and imaging the department's entire digital footprint. The initial sweep of the records room was already painting a horrifying picture. Extortion of local business owners, falsified arrest warrants used to intimidate political rivals, and a staggering amount of cash missing from the Civil Asset Forfeiture Fund. Harlan Briggs had been running Oak Haven not as a law enforcement officer, but as a mafia don. Elias Voss sat at a clear desk in what used to be a lieutenant's office, sipping a fresh cup of coffee provided by SAC Whitfield. The door was open, allowing Elias to oversee the dismantling of the corrupt department. A shadow fell over the doorway. It was Deputy Cole Brennan. He looked exhausted, terrified, and entirely uncertain of his own fate. "Come in, Deputy," Elias said, gesturing to the chair opposite the desk. Brennan stepped in hesitantly and sat down on the absolute edge of the chair, his hands clasped nervously in his lap. "Sir, Director Voss, I wanted to say I'm sorry for my part in this. I should have stopped him at the diner. Elias studied the young man. He saw fear, but he also saw genuine remorse. You were operating under the command of a tyrannical superior. Brennan, I have studied the psychology of these departments for 3 decades. The pressure to conform, to look the other way, is immense, Elias said softly. But in the critical moment when it mattered most, you chose to uphold your oath. You made the phone call. You tried to draw your weapon to stop him from assaulting me. Brennan looked down at his boots. He would have fired me, or worse. He will never fire anyone again, Elias stated. Special Agent Whitfield is going to need a cooperating witness who knows where the bodies are buried in this department. I suggest you tell him everything. Every bribe, every false arrest, every time Briggs used his badge to hurt someone. If you do that, you will not face federal charges. You will be a witness for the prosecution. Brennan looked up, tears of profound relief welling in his eyes. I will, sir. I'll tell them everything. I promise. Good. Dismissed, deputy. As Brennan left the room, Harlow appeared in the doorway. Director, we are ready to transport the prisoner to the federal holding facility in Atlanta. The press has caught wind of the movement. There's a crowd gathering outside. Elias nodded, standing up. Let's go. Elias walked out into the booking room, followed closely by Harlow and Whitfield. Sheriff Briggs was standing near the Sallyport door, surrounded by 4 heavily armed tactical operators. He looked ruined. His uniform was rumpled. His face was tear-stained, and his head hung low in absolute shame. As the heavy Sallyport doors rolled open, the blinding Georgia sunlight flooded into the dim concrete bunker. Beyond the tactical vehicles, behind the yellow crime scene tapes strung across the street, a massive crowd had formed. News of the FBI raid had spread through Oak Haven like wildfire. Residents had poured out of their homes and businesses, lining the sidewalks. As the agents marched Briggs out of the building, a profound silence fell over the crowd. The townspeople stared in disbelief. Their tormentor, the man who had terrorized them, who had operated above the law for 20 years, was being perp-walked out of his own fortress in federal chains. Then, somewhere in the back of the crowd, someone started clapping. It was a slow, solitary clap. But within seconds, it spread. Dozens of people joined in, then hundreds. The applause washed over the street, a cathartic release of decades of pent-up fear and oppression. Elias stood near the armored Suburban, watching the scene unfold. He saw Clara, the waitress from Pat's Skillet, standing near the front of the barricade, wiping a tear from her cheek. She caught Elias's eye and offered a small, deeply grateful nod. Elias nodded back. The operator shoved Briggs into the back of a black transport van, entirely ignoring his pathetic whimpers. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing the tyrant's fate. "We're ready to roll, Director," Harlow said, opening the rear door of the Suburban. Elias took one last look at the Oak Haven County Sheriff's Department. The sign on the building suddenly looked very small. "Let's go home, Trent," Elias said, stepping into the cool, air-conditioned interior of the SUV. As the motorcade pulled away, leaving the cheering town behind, Elias settled into his seat. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and opened a fresh email to the Attorney General. The subject line read, Oak Haven Corruption Sweep. Sometimes the system was broken, sometimes bad men hid behind the shield. But today, justice had arrived in a small Georgia diner, quietly ordered breakfast, and burned the corruption to the ground. Thank you for reading this incredible true-to-life story of justice prevailing against corrupt authority. If this story of the ultimate twist and the takedown of a bully sheriff kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with your friends to spread the message that nobody is above the law, and subscribe to our channel with notifications turned on so you never miss our dramatic real-life inspired stories. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were in the diner? See you in the next one.